They laughed at me in the comments. Old lady with her mouth open. That mouth. And still silent. I was just sleeping. I remember the way the light slipped softly through the curtains, casting pale stripes across the worn quilt that covered the sagging armchair where I had dozed off. It was late afternoon, the kind of quiet that feels like the world is holding its breath. I was tired. The kind of tired that comes from years and years of giving everything and being expected to keep giving without a word of thanks, without a break. My name is Galina Nikolaevna. I am 81 years old, and I live on the southern edge of Krasnodar now, in a small, quiet apartment with cracked windows that rattle in the wind. The only company I have these days is my cat, a little striped creature who curls up beside me as if she understands more than I say aloud. But it was not always this way. There was a time when my home was filled with voices, laughter, the clatter of plates, and the endless parade of family gatherings. There were birthdays and holidays, and I was always at the center, the one who made the meals, who told the stories, who held us all together. And then, one day, the voices stopped speaking to me. Instead, they spoke about me. I never imagined I would become the subject of mockery in my own house, the invisible woman whose tired face was a joke to be shared online for likes and laughs. The first time I saw a photo of myself sleeping on the couch, I didn't know what to think. My granddaughter had taken it while I napped, she said, just for fun. But it was not fun to me. The photo was posted on her social media with cruel captions and a stream of laughing emojis. Thousands of people saw it, and I was humiliated in silence. I tried to confront them gently, to ask why they thought this was funny, but my words were met with dismissal. "Oh, Grandma, don't be so sensitive," they told me. "It's just a joke." The cameras they installed around the house, supposedly for my safety after my fall, became instruments of control and ridicule. Every moment was watched, every movement recorded, as if I were some exhibit rather than a person with dignity. Their laughter echoed in my ears, not just in those digital comments, but in the sharp glances and whispered conversations when they thought I wasn't listening. It was as if I had become an object, a character in their story, not a woman with memories and feelings. I remember the nights when I would lie awake, the house too loud with their chatter and my own growing despair. They spoke over me, about me, never with me. It was a slow erasure, a quiet violence that chipped away at my spirit. The kitchen was no longer a place where I could find solace. It was a stage where I was made to perform the role of the silly old grandmother, the harmless relic whose pain was invisible. And yet, beneath the surface, something stubborn refused to die. One evening, when they were gone, I found their tax returns stored on a shared laptop, documents that spoke of hidden wealth and secret accounts, a sharp contrast to the way they treated me. It was then I realized that power was not only in their hands, but could be reclaimed. I did not seek revenge in the dramatic sense, but I wanted balance, a way to be seen not as a punchline, but as a woman who knew her worth. So I posted their tax returns online. It was not an act of cruelty, but a declaration of presence, a reminder that even the quietest among us have voices that can be heard if they choose to speak. The aftermath was swift. The tax authorities called. The family was shaken, and the cameras came down. They left the house, but this time, I stayed. Not as a background figure, but as the one who had taken back control. Now as I sit in my quiet apartment, the evening light soft on the walls, I understand that dignity is not something given. It is something you fight for, piece by piece, day by day. If you find yourself alone and laughed at, remember that silence is not weakness, and the smallest acts can become the loudest declarations. This is my story, told in the voice of a woman who was invisible until she was not, who was mocked until she stood tall again, and who now knows that freedom is the most precious gift of all. The moment everything changed was not marked by a grand confrontation or a loud argument. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it cut deeper than any shouted insult could. It began with the arrival of the camera, a small, unassuming device mounted in the corner of the kitchen, its tiny red light blinking softly, a quiet sentinel watching over every meal prepared, every cup of tea poured, every tired sigh released in the solitude of my days. At first I told myself it was for my safety, a necessary precaution after my fall, an act of love disguised as technology. But soon I realized that it was not my safety they cared about. It was control. The camera was a window into my private world, a tool they wielded with careless amusement, sharing moments I thought were mine alone with friends, with strangers on the internet, laughing at my exhaustion, at my frailty. One evening, as I rested on the faded couch, the weight of my years pressing down like the heavy quilt draped over my knees, I felt the gentle vibration of my phone. It was a notification, a message from my granddaughter. With trembling hands, I opened it, and there it was, a photo of me, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, captured in a moment of unguarded sleep, posted for all to see. The caption beneath was cruel, mocking, and the flood of comments beneath it was a chorus of derision. I sat there in stunned silence, the room suddenly too bright, the air too thin. The betrayal was not just in the image, but in the fact that those I had loved and cared for thought it was acceptable to turn my vulnerability into entertainment. When I confronted them, my voice barely above a whisper, they laughed it off as a harmless joke, telling me to lighten up and stop being so sensitive. Their words stung more than the betrayal itself because they revealed the truth. I was no longer seen as a person deserving respect, but as a source of amusement, a subject to be humiliated. The days that followed were a slow descent into invisibility. The camera followed me everywhere, into the bathroom, into my bedroom, even while I sat quietly reading or simply resting. I learned to move carefully, to minimize my presence, hoping to avoid being captured in some new humiliating snapshot. But they were relentless, sharing images and videos with a careless disregard that left me feeling exposed, stripped of dignity. I tried to retreat, to reclaim some semblance of privacy, but every corner of the house felt invaded, every quiet moment punctured by the threat of exposure. The digital world became a prison, and I was its unwilling prisoner, trapped behind a screen of laughter and scorn. It was during one of these moments of despair that I discovered something that shifted everything. While searching for a moment of escape, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with my granddaughter's laptop open in front of me. Hesitating only briefly, I clicked through the files, uncovering a trove of documents, tax returns, bank statements, photographs of money stacked on desks, secret purchases made with credit cards hidden from me. It was a stark contrast to the way I had been treated, a glaring reminder of the power they held and the arrogance with which they wielded it. In that moment, I felt a surge of something I had long forgotten: strength. I realized that although I had been made invisible, dismissed, and mocked, I still held weapons of my own. They had used my vulnerability against me, but now I could use their secrets as a shield and a sword. It was not revenge I sought, for revenge is a fire that consumes the one who burns it, but a reckoning, a way to reclaim the dignity that had been so callously stripped away. With careful hands, I saved the documents to a hidden flash drive, tucking it away like a precious talisman. I did not act immediately. Instead, I waited and watched, gathering the courage and clarity I needed. When they returned that night, tipsy and laughing, ready once again to mock and to belittle, I stood firm and said no. No more videos, no more photos, no more games at my expense. They laughed at my defiance, telling me I was old and forgetful, that I didn't know what I was doing. But their laughter was hollow, their eyes betraying a flicker of unease. For the first time, I was not afraid. The next morning, I took the flash drive and created a new anonymous online account. With steady hands, I began to upload the documents, exposing their financial secrets to the world. It was a quiet act, done in the stillness of dawn, but its echo was thunderous. Calls came from the tax office, inquiries were made, and within days, the cameras disappeared from my home, the laughter ceased, and the house felt different. No longer a stage for cruelty, but a sanctuary for survival. I did not gloat. I did not celebrate. Instead, I sat quietly in the reclaimed silence, feeling the weight of years lift just a little. I understood then that power is not always loud. Sometimes, it is the quiet insistence that you will no longer be invisible, that you will no longer be a joke. This was my awakening, my catalyst, a painful but necessary breaking point that forced me to see the truth of those I called family and the truth of my own strength. It was the moment when the watching eyes met a gaze steady and unflinching, and the game finally changed. After that day when I posted their tax returns, life inside the house shifted, but not in the way I had hoped. The cameras were gone, yes, and the cruel laughter faded from the digital world. But the quiet war they waged against me only deepened in subtlety and shadow. It was as if, having lost their loud weapon, they chose instead to weaponize silence, indifference, and small acts of erasure that wore me down like winter frost. I could no longer count on moments of peace, for even when they looked away, their absence spoke volumes, louder than any insult. The house, once my refuge and place of belonging, became a place where I was increasingly invisible. They no longer needed to capture my image to control me. They simply ignored me, refused to include me in conversations or decisions, and treated me like a ghost wandering through their carefully curated lives. At the dinner table, my presence was tolerated but unacknowledged, as if I were a piece of furniture rather than a person. When I asked about plans or mentioned memories from the past, they answered with polite nods or changed the subject, avoiding eye contact as if my words were unwelcome guests. It was a slow and painful suffocation, a stripping away of my voice and my space, leaving me to shrink into the corners of the rooms I had once filled with warmth and stories. I found myself retreating more and more into the quiet rhythms of my own days, walking through the neighborhood in long, solitary stretches that soothed the ache of being unseen. These walks became a lifeline, a way to breathe beyond the walls that no longer held me. I passed familiar places. Some changed beyond recognition, others stubbornly the same, and with each step, I tried to reclaim a piece of myself that had been lost in the growing shadows of neglect. At home, I busied myself with small tasks that no one noticed, but that kept me grounded. A cup of tea brewed just so, a flower watered carefully on the windowsill, pages turned in books I had loved long ago. The kitchen table where they once gathered for celebrations now sat empty, save for the dust that settled in the silence. I learned to eat alone, not because I wanted to, but because that was where I belonged now, at the edge of their world, excluded but still present. Attempts to reach out were met with cool replies or forgotten entirely. Calls went unanswered, questions dismissed with vague promises to talk later that never came. Invitations to family events arrived as afterthoughts, buried in group messages where I was just one name among many. The few times I spoke up, asserting a wish or a need, I was met with impatience or a swift change of subject. Their eyes slid past me, as if I were no longer part of the story they were telling about themselves. It was a silence heavier than any shouted insult, a quiet denial that I existed beyond the role of the aging matriarch whose presence was convenient but never celebrated. The emotional toll was immense, but outwardly, I maintained a calm that belied the storm inside. I could feel myself unraveling, thread by thread, but I held on to the remnants of pride and memory, reminding myself who I was beyond the narrow frame they forced upon me. I began keeping a small journal, writing late into the night when the house was still, and the weight of the day could be lifted, if only for a moment, onto the pages. In those private reflections, I traced the contours of my pain and my hopes, mapping out the invisible scars left by neglect and ridicule. I documented the small victories, the times I refused to answer the phone when their voices carried the coldness of abandonment, the moments I chose to walk away rather than beg for recognition. These acts of quiet resistance became my rebellion, the flickers of light in an otherwise dim landscape. I also noticed how their treatment changed my own reflection in the mirror. The woman who looked back at me was older than before. Yes, with lines etched deep by years of heartache and disappointment. But there was also a new hardness in her eyes, a resilience that had not been there before. I was learning to survive not by their rules, but by carving out a space where I could still breathe and exist on my own terms. Yet the loneliness was sharp and constant. Nights were the hardest, when the house fell silent except for the ticking of clocks and the occasional creak of settling walls. The absence of their voices became deafening. I would sit by the window, watching the world move beyond my reach, and wonder if they missed me at all, or if I had become a shadow in their memories, something better forgotten. The feeling of being erased was suffocating, but I refused to disappear. Slowly, I began reaching out beyond the walls that confined me. I reconnected with old friends through letters and phone calls, people who remembered the woman I used to be, and welcomed her back without judgment or pity. Their voices were balm to my weary soul, reminding me that I was more than the sum of their neglect. In these connections, I found a flicker of hope, a reminder that life could still hold meaning beyond the narrow definitions imposed by family and circumstance. I also started volunteering at a local community center, a small gesture that gave me purpose and a sense of belonging outside the house that had become a prison. Preparing meals for others, sharing stories with those who listened, I rediscovered the joy of being seen and valued. The work was hard, and my body protested, but the reward was immeasurable. In the midst of this quiet rebuilding, I faced moments of despair and doubt. The weight of exclusion pressed down, and I questioned whether I was strong enough to endure. But each time, I found something within myself that refused to yield. The woman who had been mocked and ignored was still there, buried beneath layers of hurt but alive and determined. The first escalation was not a sudden eruption of defiance, but a slow, steady reclaiming of self. It was in the small acts of care I gave myself, the boundaries I set against intrusion, and the new connections I nurtured outside the fractured family circle. It was in the whispered promises to myself that I would not be broken by their neglect. This phase taught me that survival was an act of courage, that resilience was built not in grand gestures, but in the quiet persistence of choosing oneself every day. Though the road ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenges, I knew that I was no longer the woman who slept with her mouth open and was laughed at for it. I was a woman who had begun to stand again, who had begun to find her own voice amid the silence. This was the first step on a long journey, the subtle yet profound turning point where invisibility began to lose its power, and the possibility of freedom and dignity took root. There came a moment when the weight of silence and invisibility, which had long pressed down upon me, shifted into something else, a subtle awakening that grew not from anger or despair, but from a quiet determination to reclaim my life on my own terms. It was not a sudden epiphany or a dramatic breaking point, but rather a gradual turning inward, a gathering of strength that started to ripple outward into the spaces I occupied. I began by creating boundaries that felt like small revolutions, no longer answering every call, no longer shrinking in their presence or waiting for permission to speak. These acts, though modest, became the foundation for a new self, one that was no longer willing to be sidelined or diminished. At the same time, I sought refuge beyond the walls that had become my cage, venturing out into the world with tentative steps that soon grew more confident. I found a small community center nearby where I could volunteer, a place filled with others who carried their own stories of loss and renewal. There, Among faces weathered by time and hardship, I discovered connection and purpose. The work was humble, preparing meals, sorting donations, listening to stories, but it filled a space in me that had been empty for too long. For the first time in years, I felt seen not as a burden or a source of amusement, but as a person with value and something to give. This new rhythm of giving and belonging began to restore a sense of dignity I had thought lost. Alongside this, I started to reclaim the physical space of my life. The small apartment I had moved into after the final fracture with my family was modest and unassuming, but it was mine, and that fact alone gave me a new kind of freedom. I decorated it with care, choosing each item with intention: a vase of fresh flowers, a warm throw on the armchair, a framed photograph of a place I once loved. These objects became symbols of a life rebuilt from the fragments of the old. I even bought myself a new coat, a simple wool one in navy blue, its fabric thick and reassuring against the chill of autumn winds. Wearing it was like wrapping myself in a declaration that I was still here, still worthy, still capable of choosing for myself. Each morning I put it on and stepped out into the world, feeling a quiet pride in the woman I was becoming. This was the turning point, the midpoint in my journey, a shift from victim to actor, from silent suffering to deliberate living. It was a shift marked not by dramatic confrontations, but by the steady accumulation of small victories. A smile exchanged with a neighbor, a compliment from a stranger on my coat, a moment of laughter shared with a fellow volunteer. These moments stitched together a new narrative, one in which I was not an object of pity or ridicule, but a woman with agency and voice. I also began to reconnect with those parts of myself I had long neglected: the reader, the dreamer, the woman who once believed in a future full of possibilities. Books, once gathering dust on forgotten shelves, became companions again, their pages offering solace and inspiration. I rediscovered music and poetry, the arts that had once stirred my soul and reminded me of beauty beyond pain. In this quieter, deeper space, I found the courage to forgive, not for their sake, but for mine. To release the anger and hurt that had tethered me to the past, and to open myself to the possibility of peace. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting or condoning what had been done. It meant freeing myself from the chains of resentment that held me captive. This internal shift was reflected in the way I carried myself, in the steadiness of my gaze and the calmness of my voice. I no longer sought their approval or feared their judgment. I was beginning to stand tall, not because I had forgotten the wounds, but because I refused to be defined by them. The community I found became a new family of sorts, people who listened without pity, who shared without judgment, who embraced the messy reality of life with all its imperfections. Among them, I learned that resilience is not a solitary act but a shared journey, and that healing often comes in the company of others who understand. This sense of belonging was a balm to my spirit, softening the edges of loneliness and giving me strength to face each new day. The midpoint was also marked by a renewed connection with a distant grandson who, unlike others, reached out with genuine concern and quiet love. Our conversations were sparse at first, filled with pauses and tentative words, but they grew richer over time, a bridge spanning the gulf that had formed in my family. He was a reminder that not all ties were broken, that some threads remained intact, waiting to be woven into something new. This relationship was fragile and imperfect, but it was real, and that made all the difference. As I embraced this new chapter, I understood that the journey ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when the old wounds would ache with fresh intensity. But I no longer faced them alone or unarmed. I had built a foundation of strength, connection, and self-respect that could carry me forward. This was not just survival. It was a reclaiming of life itself. The midpoint was the turning point where I stopped waiting for rescue and began to rescue myself, where I moved from silence to voice, from invisibility to presence. It was the moment when the door that had been closed so long creaked open just enough to let in light and air, promising a path forward, not back to what was lost, but toward what could be built anew. The fragile peace I had begun to build was soon tested in ways I had neither expected nor welcomed, as the past, with all its tangled threads and unresolved pain, came rushing back to confront me in sharp, unyielding waves. The letters started arriving quietly at first, tucked between bills and advertisements, their presence almost unnoticed in the small pile of mail I received each day. But soon they became impossible to ignore. Handwritten notes from my grandson Kieran, filled with worry and hope, asking if I was safe, if I missed them, if I would come home. His words were gentle, without blame, a lifeline stretched across the gulf that had opened between us. I kept those letters close, reading them over and over, the inked lines softening with time as the folds in the paper wore thin. Yet I did not respond immediately, unsure if I was ready to open that door again. The visit from Lisa was far more jarring. She appeared at the cafe where I worked, a place that had become a sanctuary amid the turmoil, a small corner of the world where I was rebuilding my life piece by piece. I recognized her immediately, the carefully tailored coat, the sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing, the forced smile that barely masked the tension beneath. She stood stiffly by the pastry display, pretending to read the chalkboard menu, but her presence was like a storm cloud hanging over the room. I did not approach her, choosing instead to finish my work, to let her presence hang in the air between us, heavy and charged with unspoken words. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and cautious, a tentative olive branch extended with reluctance. "Can we talk?" she asked, and I nodded toward the empty booth at the back, a space away from prying eyes. What followed was a conversation fraught with tension and half-truths, with confessions and denials tangled together in a fragile web. Lisa admitted the panic they felt when I disappeared, the frantic search, the worry for the grandchildren, the desperate calls that went unanswered. She spoke of Adam's fury, his frustration at losing control, and the pain Lisa herself felt, caught between loyalty to her family and the strain of a fractured relationship. Yet beneath her words, I sensed something else, a defensiveness, a refusal to fully acknowledge the hurt they had caused, and a desire to maintain the illusion of concern rather than confront the reality of their actions. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, a small offering that held money for Kieran, a gesture meant to bridge the gap yet laden with conditions and expectations. I took the envelope without enthusiasm, not because I wanted what was inside, but because refusing it outright would give her satisfaction. "He doesn't need a go-between," I told her quietly. "He knows how to call." Our conversation ended without resolution, leaving a lingering sense of sadness and missed opportunity. Lisa's words about not wanting my shadow in every room struck me deeply, a raw admission of the unspoken tensions that had long simmered beneath the surface. I stood and told her, "I'm not your shadow. I'm my own person, and I'm finally remembering how to be one." She left without finishing her coffee, and I watched her go, feeling a mixture of relief and sorrow. Soon after, I received a letter from Adam, sharp, angry, accusing me of abandonment and selfishness, recasting my disappearance as a tantrum rather than a choice. His words were cold and clinical, filled with demands and veiled threats, a legal challenge to my autonomy wrapped in the guise of concern. I folded the letter carefully, feeling no anger but a profound sense of finality. I was done with their attempts to rewrite the story and dictate my life. The arrival of the regional news article, sent to me by a neighbor who had seen it in the local paper, was another blow. The headlines screamed about a missing matriarch, and the family's statements portrayed me as vulnerable and confused, as if I had wandered off without a thought for those I left behind. The performance of worry, the public spectacle, felt obscene to me, a betrayal that cut deeper than any private slight. Yet amidst the turmoil, I found support in unexpected places. Heather at the cafe offered kindness without questions, saving me crossword puzzles and sharing cinnamon rolls, small acts that spoke volumes. Arthur, a widower who frequented the cafe, became a steady presence, his quiet companionship a balm to my fractured spirit. Our conversations about birds and books, about the small wonders of life, grounded me in the present and reminded me that connection was still possible. As legal representatives from Adam and Lisa approached me with formalities and warnings, I stood firm. I refused to be treated as a ward or a pet. I told their lawyer plainly that I was of sound mind, living in a safe environment, and under no duress. Any further contact would be considered harassment. This declaration was not a surrender but a reclaiming of my dignity and boundaries. The struggle was not without cost. The memories of years spent caring, sacrificing, and being dismissed weighed heavily, but I no longer carried them as a burden. Instead, I carried them as proof of my resilience. I wrote letters, not to the family who had cast me aside, but to those who had shown me kindness, and to myself, affirmations of strength and the promise of new beginnings. When Lisa appeared again, this time unannounced and vulnerable, I held my ground. Our exchange was raw and honest, a confrontation that laid bare the fractures and the wounds. I told her that I was no longer the woman they had tried to control, that I was building a life on my own terms. She left, and I closed the door behind her, the sound final and resolute. In the quiet that followed, I found peace. I baked cakes for the community potluck, shared laughter and stories with new friends, and embraced the freedom of a life reclaimed. The house that had once echoed with exclusion now resonated with the quiet strength of a woman who had chosen herself. This second escalation was a trial by fire, a reckoning with the past and a forging of a new identity. It tested my resolve, pushed me to my limits, and ultimately revealed the depth of my courage. I was no longer the subject of their control or the victim of their neglect. I was a woman who had stood tall amid the storm and found the strength to say, "I am here, and I will not be unseen." The moment I decided to take back my power was not heralded by fanfare or dramatic declarations, but came quietly, almost imperceptibly, as I sat alone in the small sunlit kitchen of my apartment. The house was still, save for the distant hum of the city beyond the cracked window. I held the flash drive tightly in my hand, the same one containing their tax returns and financial secrets, a trove of hidden truths they had never imagined I would uncover. For years, I had been the subject of their mockery, their control, and their indifference, but now, finally, I was ready to reclaim my story and my dignity. The decision to publish the documents online was not made lightly. I understood the weight of this act, the potential consequences for both myself and those I once called family. But more than fear or hesitation, I felt a fierce clarity. This was no longer about revenge. It was about justice, balance, and the quiet assertion of my worth. I remembered the nights spent awake, the tears shed in silence, the slow erosion of my spirit under their relentless gaze. I thought of the cameras that had watched me sleep, the cruel captions and the endless stream of laughter at my expense. The image of myself, vulnerable and exposed, contrasted sharply with the wealth they had hidden behind closed doors. It was time for the scales to tip. Sitting at my old wooden desk, the surface scarred with years of use, I connected the flash drive to the laptop and began the meticulous process of uploading the files to a secure, anonymous website. Each document I shared peeled back another layer of their carefully constructed facade: income declarations, hidden assets, questionable expenses, the trappings of a life built on lies and betrayal. I wrote a message to accompany the files, not to vilify or humiliate, but to bear witness to the truth and to demand accountability. The hours slipped by unnoticed as I worked, my fingers steady despite the tremor in my heart. When the last file was uploaded, I leaned back, feeling the weight of what I had done settle around me. The aftermath was swift and undeniable. Within days, the tax authorities initiated an investigation, calls were made, and a legal storm descended upon my family. The cameras vanished from my home, the laughter ceased, and the atmosphere that had once suffocated me began to clear. But the real victory was not in their punishment or my vindication. It was in the reclamation of my voice and my autonomy. I no longer felt like a prisoner in my own life, but the author of my future. The days that followed were marked by a profound sense of calm and resolution. I no longer needed to prove myself to anyone or to live under the shadow of their judgment. I spent mornings in the garden, tending to the flowers I had planted as symbols of renewal. Afternoons were filled with visits to the community center, where I found joy in small acts of kindness and connection. The evenings, once heavy with loneliness, were now moments of quiet reflection and peace. Though the scars of the past remained, they no longer defined me. I had learned that power is not always loud or violent. Sometimes, it is the gentle but unyielding assertion of self-respect and truth. The flash drive, once a secret weapon, became a symbol of my journey. From victim to survivor, from silence to voice. I thought often of the women who might listen to my story, who might feel invisible or powerless in their own lives. To them I offer this: your dignity is yours to reclaim, your voice yours to raise. No act of cruelty or neglect can diminish your worth unless you allow it. Stand firm, hold fast to your truth, and know that freedom comes not from others, but from within. This was my climax, the moment when I took back what was mine and stepped into the light of my own making. A woman unbroken and unbowed, ready to live on her own terms. In the quiet that followed the storm of revelations and confrontations, I found myself in a space I had longed for but never truly believed I would reach. A calm, steady place where the noise of betrayal and exclusion had finally settled into a distant echo. The house, once filled with shadows of mockery and silent dismissals, now stood as a testament to resilience and renewal. I no longer felt the weight of their judgments pressing down on my shoulders. Instead, I carried a gentle strength that came from knowing I had reclaimed my story and my dignity. The mornings began with the soft light filtering through the curtains, a reminder that each day was a new beginning. I sipped my tea slowly, savoring the warmth and the quiet, moments once stolen by fear and humiliation, now held as sacred. The apartment, modest and simple, had become a sanctuary. A place where I could exist fully as myself without the need to hide or apologize. The cat, my faithful companion, curled up beside me, a small comfort in the vastness of solitude that I had learned to embrace rather than fear. I thought often about the path that had led me here, the long years of giving and being disregarded, the betrayal that had cut so deeply, and the strength it took to stand again after being cast aside. It was a journey marked not by grand gestures, but by small, determined steps, a refusal to be erased, a commitment to hold on to self-respect in the face of cruelty. I found peace in the rituals I created for myself, tending to the flowers on the windowsill, reading books that had once gathered dust, writing letters that needed no response but served as a testament to my enduring voice. The community I had found through volunteering became a lifeline, a circle of faces and stories that reminded me I was not alone. Among them, I shared laughter and tears, hopes and fears, building connections that nourished my spirit and softened the sharp edges of loneliness. The legal battles and family dramas that had once consumed me faded into the background, their power diminished by the clarity of my new perspective. I no longer sought approval or validation from those who had caused me pain. Instead, I focused on the present and the possibilities it held. There were moments of sadness, of course, when memories surfaced and the ache of lost relationships pressed against my heart. But these moments no longer defined me. They were threads woven into a larger tapestry of resilience and hope. I learned to hold them gently, neither denying their presence nor allowing them to consume me. As the seasons changed, so too did I. The winter's cold gave way to the soft promises of spring, and with it came a renewed sense of purpose and joy. I embraced the freedom to live on my own terms, to make choices guided by my own needs and desires rather than the expectations of others. I walked the neighborhood with a steadiness and grace that surprised even me, finding beauty in the small things. The laughter of children playing, the scent of blooming flowers, the warmth of the sun on my face. To any woman who finds herself invisible, dismissed, or mocked, I offer this truth. You are not alone, and your worth is not diminished by the cruelty of others. There is a strength within you, waiting to be claimed, a voice that deserves to be heard. It is not always easy to find, and the journey may be long and fraught with pain, but it is possible to stand tall again. You do not have to wait for others to acknowledge your value. You can claim it for yourself, piece by piece, day by day. Freedom is not something given. It is something you create through courage, resilience, and the unwavering belief in your own dignity. My story is but one among many, a testament to the power of quiet defiance and the enduring spirit of those who refuse to be erased. In the end, I am not the woman who was photographed sleeping and laughed at online. I am a woman who stood in the storm and emerged stronger, a woman who reclaimed her life and her voice, and who now lives with the peaceful certainty that she is enough. It had been months since the last confrontation, and though I would never claim that time heals all wounds, I had begun to understand how it can soften their edges until they no longer cut so deeply. My days followed a gentle rhythm now. Mornings spent reading by the window with a cup of tea, afternoons at the community center helping with the lunch program, evenings in the park watching the last of the daylight fade. It was a life without the constant tension of watchful eyes and cruel laughter, and though it was quieter than the one I once knew, it was mine in a way nothing had been for years. I had almost convinced myself that they would stay away, that the chapter of my life defined by humiliation and control was truly closed. But one late afternoon in early spring, as I was walking back from the market with a bag of fresh bread and apples, I saw a figure waiting near the entrance to my building. The way she stood, slightly hunched, but still holding herself with that familiar air of superiority, made my stomach tighten. It was Lisa. I considered turning away, pretending I hadn't seen her, but something in her expression, more fragile than I remembered, kept me moving forward. She didn't greet me right away. Instead, she glanced at the bag in my hand, as if surprised that I still carried on with the mundane rituals of living. "You look well," she said finally, though her voice was tinged with something I couldn't quite name. I unlocked the door and motioned for her to come inside, not out of warmth, but because I disliked having these kinds of conversations in public. She hesitated before stepping in, her eyes scanning the modest apartment, taking in the worn armchair, the books stacked neatly on the side table, the vase of tulips on the windowsill. I could almost hear her thinking that this was a far cry from the larger, livelier house where we had once shared space. She didn't waste much time before getting to the point. "Adam's in trouble," she said, avoiding my eyes. "Financial trouble. We might lose the house." The words hung between us like smoke, and I realized she was waiting for me to offer help. Perhaps money, perhaps sympathy, as if the past had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. I felt a strange detachment, as though I were observing this conversation from far away. In the past, I might have rushed to reassure her, to smooth over the tension, to offer whatever I could. But the woman I had become was not the same as the one they had laughed at. I set the bread and apples on the counter and poured myself a glass of water, letting the silence stretch just long enough for her to feel its weight. "And you're telling me this because—" I asked. She flinched slightly at the coolness in my tone. "Because you're family," she said, and there was a hint of desperation now. Because you know how to handle things. I thought of all the times I'd been left out of decisions, spoken over, diminished to a background presence in my own home. I thought of the photos taken without my consent, the captions written to make strangers laugh at my expense. Family is more than a word, I said slowly. It's how you treat someone when you think no one's watching. Her lips tightened, and for a moment I saw the defensiveness that had once defined her, but it softened almost immediately into something like shame. I'm not asking for myself, she added quickly. It's for the kids. They don't deserve to... I stopped her with a small gesture. Neither did I said. But here we are. The truth was, I had no desire to see them lose their home, but I also knew that stepping in now would be a return to the very patterns I had fought so hard to break. Helping them financially would not heal the old wounds, and it would not change the way they saw me. It would simply erase the progress I had made in reclaiming my autonomy. Lisa sat very still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. You've changed, she said finally. I nodded. Yes, and that's a good thing. There was nothing more to say after that, and she seemed to understand. She rose from the chair, thanked me for listening, and walked to the door. I didn't follow her out. I stayed where I was, listening to the sound of her footsteps fade down the hall. That night, I lay awake for a long time, thinking about the way her voice had trembled and the way her eyes had darted around the room as if searching for something familiar. There had been no apology in her words, no real acknowledgement of the past, only the same expectation that I would step in when needed. But for the first time, I didn't feel guilty for saying no. I felt steady. A week later, a letter arrived from Kieran, my grandson, written in the same careful handwriting as before. He told me about school, about his friends, about the dog they had adopted from a shelter. At the bottom of the page, he wrote, I hope I see you soon. I miss you. His words warmed something in me that I had thought was gone. I wrote back, telling him about the tulips and the cafe where I sometimes stopped for tea, about the books I was reading, about the way the air smelled like rain in the afternoons. I told him I missed him too, and that one day we would see each other again. That small exchange reminded me that not all connections are broken beyond repair. Some can survive even the longest winters if tended to with care. But I also knew that those connections had to be nurtured in ways that didn't compromise who I had become. I could love without losing myself, and I could care without stepping back into the role they had once forced upon me. Life went on. The tulips eventually wilted and were replaced by daffodils. The bread from the market was shared with a neighbor who had just returned from surgery. The park filled with children playing in the lengthening days of summer, and I, in the midst of it all, carried forward, not as someone waiting to be needed or recognized, but as a woman who had learned that her worth was not up for negotiation. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer dictated the shape of my days. I had chosen my path, and I would walk it with a steady heart, no matter who appeared at my door. It was just past midday when I heard the knock at my door, firm and deliberate, the kind of knock that doesn't belong to a stranger. I hesitated, the weight of the moment settling over me before I even reached the handle. When I opened it, there stood Adam. His presence was heavier than the spring air that drifted in from the hallway, his eyes sharp but carrying something I had not seen before, an undercurrent of unease. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, scanning the room as if measuring the space I now called home. You've been ignoring us, he said, his voice calm but edged. I said nothing at first, waiting for him to speak again. Lisa told me she came to you. She said you turned her away. He paused, studying my face. You've made your point, but this has gone far enough. We need your help. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, but my voice stayed steady. Help with what? saving you from the consequences of your own choices?" His jaw tightened, and I could see the flicker of temper rising behind his composed mask. "This isn't just about me," he said. The kids, I interrupted, were the ones who watched me be humiliated in my own home and said nothing. Maybe they didn't understand then, but you did, Adam, and you allowed it." His gaze shifted, but he didn't look away. "We were wrong," he said at last, though the words seemed to stick in his throat. "But that doesn't change the fact that we're in trouble. And you," he leaned slightly forward, "you have the means to fix it." For a long moment, I studied him. This man I had once loved like my own son. His posture was confident, but his hands betrayed him, twitching slightly as he spoke. I thought of the years I had given to that household, the meals cooked, the celebrations organized, the countless moments I had offered freely without being asked, without thanks. And I thought of the day they turned me into a joke for strangers to laugh at, a caricature of an old woman too tired to defend herself. "I'm not here to fix you," I said finally. "I'm here to live my life." The silence that followed was heavy enough to press against my ribs. His eyes narrowed, and for a fleeting second, I saw the man who had laughed when I protested the cameras in the house, who had waved off my discomfort as if it were nothing, but then his shoulders sagged, and he let out a breath that seemed to take something out of him. "You've changed," he murmured. "Yes," I replied, "and that's why I'm still standing." He left without another word, and I watched from the window as he walked away, his pace quick, almost agitated. I wondered if this was truly the last time I would see him, but I didn't cling to the thought. I had learned that some doors, once closed, must stay shut for your own survival. That evening, I sat at my desk and wrote another letter to Kieran. I didn't mention the visit. Instead, I told him about the cherry blossoms in the park and the stray dog that had taken to following me on my walks. I described the way the light shifted in my apartment in the late afternoon, turning the walls a soft gold. And I ended the letter by saying, "We choose the people we keep close, and I'm glad I choose you." When I sealed the envelope, I felt no lingering anger, only the certainty that I had done the right thing. My life was not built for their emergencies anymore. My days belonged to me now, and I intended to spend them in peace, no matter how many times the past came knocking.